Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Today, we're going to jump onto a project that I've been putting off for just a little bit. It's a little bit of automotive electrical. More so what we're looking at, though, is I want to show you guys some tips and tricks, some stuff that I like to do in particular to keep kind of a neat finished product when I'm dealing with automotive electric. Let's jump in. So when I did my aftermarket bumper and tire carrier, when I moved everything around, I no longer have lights on the license plate, but CavFab gives you these two little locations here that you can actually mount lights on there. So today what we're going to do is we're going to throw on these cool little LED license plate lights. Artec has a kit. That's the one that I grabbed. Artec always makes awesome stuff, but you can actually pick these things up from Amazon pretty cheap. With the Artec kit, though, you do get the wire and weather pack connector with the terminals and everything in there. So it's kind of a nice little kit. When you're adding wiring to an existing circuit, basically, again, I'm going to tee off of the existing lighting circuit. I came underneath and I found that pigtail right here on the Jeep. And that's the lighting, or that's the pigtail that does everything for the trailer wiring. So I know I can pull signal off of that. So once you find that, you're going to use your meter and you're going to get in there and you're just going to kind of tone it. You're going to see if you can find a 12-volt source that is specific for what you're working with. The first thing you have to do is you have to find your ground. And I've already tested for ground. I figured out on this pigtail that I actually do have a ground wire. Got that tested. Now the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put one of my test leads on the ground. And I'm going to check the rest of these locations and see what I have for reading. And there's one of them that's going to be constant hot. And then the others are going to be, I got it set on milliamps, so it's going to be set or showing just a little bit there on the bottom. But other than that, you've got that one right there. That's your constant hot. That's with the engine off, no power to the lights. Everything else shows minimal. So next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to put power to the lights and then I'm going to retest. And that should show me which one of those leads is going to be sending power for the tail lights so I can pull off for my license plate lights. Next up, you have to figure out where you're going to make the connection. So I could make the connection down there, but that's right on the backside of where the tire is flinging mud, dirt, water, whatever. I could make it down inside the taillight opening, but again, that's still kind of exposed to the elements. So instead, I'm going to go ahead and come to the inside. So if you look right here, there's actually a grommet that wiring, that harness passes through to come into the cabin. So it's going to come in here, and then you got this chunk here that has those wires running through it. So right there's a nice spot that I can make that connection because it's going to be inside the cabin. It's going to be protected. If I take the top off, it's still going to be more protected because there's the plastic covering that goes over the top of this. So that's where I'm going to make that connection. So I got a few inches of the factory tape pulled back from the harness here, so I've got it exposed. You can see we've got about 3-4 inches of harness. And all these wires are what goes into the tail light, goes down into that plug there for the trailer wiring as well. So I've got this exposed, so all I have to do is then find the wire that I toned out down below, and that's going to be the one that's going to be my signal to turn on the lights. So down below, I found it was one of the white wires, but it was the white wire with the brown stripe. So you can see we've got the white with the brown stripe. There's also a couple whites with orange. There's a white with the purple in there. Make sure you have the right wire before you start cutting. I got my wire selected. Come in and give it a cut. Now, this is where the controversy starts. Now, this is where we get to take a look at how we're going to tie the wires back together and connect the new one in. Let's take a look at the workbench. All right, now let's take a look at connections. There's a handful of different ways that you can do it. Here's a few of them. The first one we're looking at here, some people call them T-taps, some call them Scotch locks, but either way, there's kind of that piece here. I've got this one laid out so you can kind of see what they do. So you put the clip around your existing wire that you're trying to get power out of to tap into, and you take your new wire and you run it in there. And then this blade, you can see it's got those 2 notches in it. It sits down on the edge of that. And then after you've got it all in there, like this one right here, you can see, you squeeze it down and that pushes the blade down in and it cuts the sheathing of the wire. But the problem is it can also cut the actual wire itself. It can cut the strands. I've seen all kinds of problems with these things being used in cars. And unfortunately, a lot of times, like stereo head units, people will use those to put them in and stuff, so they can cause issues. Another one is wire nuts. Wire nuts. They're for your house. They're not for your car.
So wire nuts, basically, you put two wires together, twist this thing on, and theoretically it holds them. Problem is, those are made for stationary. They're not made for bouncing down the road and vibration, so a lot of times they can actually cause issue. They can fall apart. I've also seen people just take two wires, tie them together, wrap them with electrical tape, send it down the road. Don't. Next up, we've got the soldering. A lot of people like solder. These are the two methods that most people are going to go for. They'll either solder or they'll crimp. So with solder, you're heating up the wire quite a bit so that you can then get the solder to melt down in, and it kind of melts down and kind of flows down into the wire, so it makes connectivity that way. It works. The problem that I have with soldering is that you're actually heating that wire quite a bit with the iron to get the solder to flow, and then that can actually make the wiring become brittle. So as it's vibrating, driving down the road again, I've seen those wires break just because they became so brittle. With crimp connections, you put the two wires together. As long as you crimp them well, you use the correct crimping tool. These are just a few. These are what I have available right now to me, but there's a ton more out there. But as long as you crimp well, the solder connections hold really nicely. I've never had a failure with them. You can do insulated or non-insulated. I personally prefer the non-insulated, and then I always just put heat shrink over the top to seal it up. So what about you? What do you think? You like solder? You like crimp connections? You like something else? Please don't tell me T-taps. Drop a comment below. Let me know what you think.
We've got our signal and our ground located here. We've got them already cut. Make sure you get them stripped. You're going to have enough wire there that you're going to make good connection. And that one. Now, if you've done much wiring on any vehicle, one thing I guarantee you have done is you've made a crimp connection without forgetting to put your heat shrink on. I'm using non-insulated butt connectors. I always prefer to use those. The ones that you can buy at the parts store. They work. To me, they're big and goofy, and I don't really like them. These I can tuck into a harness a whole lot better. It's a lot cleaner, too. So because there's no insulation on the outside, when I crimp down onto a power wire, it's going to be energized on the outside of that, so you have to make sure it's sealed. So you throw some heat shrink on it. You can get standard heat shrink, or you can get this stuff that I like. It's actually adhesive lined heat shrink. So on the inside, there's an adhesive. When you heat it up with your heat gun to get it to shrink down, it activates that adhesive that's on the inside. So it will actually seal the end of the wire. The really good stuff, the stuff that I usually will try and get, you'll actually see it looks like glue kind of coming out the end of it. It just seals it up real well. You're not going to get any moisture or debris inside that connection, so you're not going to have a failure in that regard. So if you can find it, adhesive line's always good. Anytime that you're using a crimp connector, you always want to make sure that you're crimping on an area that doesn't have a split to it. So there is different kinds of crimp connectors. You can have solid, and you can also have pieces that they're basically rolled into a tube. The ones that are rolled, the edge, it's not solid, so it can cause issues when you go to clamp down where it doesn't actually crimp it in the right location, and it won't be a good solid connection. So you always want to make sure that you're crimping real well, so it's going to hold up real well for you. Got my ground connection all made up. Everything's crimped down nice and tight, and the heat shrink's on there. Now we just got to shrink it down, and the ground side will be done and ready to go. Anytime I deal with electrical and I'm getting into the harness, I always try and get the harness looking as close to factory as possible. That way it just doesn't look all hacked up and, you know, just a ton of red wires throughout. Drives me nuts when I see just red wires everywhere. So trying to get the harness looking back like it did, or really close to what it did like when I first got the vehicle, that means I gotta have to figure out what the harness wrap material was. A lot of times on older stuff, you'll see they'll use this kind of split corrugated plastic loom. I'm not a fan of this stuff. It dries out real bad, gets real cracked and stuff. So any area that's out in the sun or exposed, or even exposed to heat, it tends to just dry up and flake and fall apart. I try not to use that too much. The one I like a lot, if it kind of goes with the factory harness, is this braided split loom. So you can see it's kind of like a braid, but it is split, so you can actually get the wire in there. You can actually get non-split too, and that works well. It looks real nice too, but it's a pain to get the wires run through those things. So you get the split stuff, it fits in there real well, has a nice clean look. On the Jeep though, it's actually just got a fabric tape that they taped that whole loom with, and that whole harness. So what I did is I went out and I got some Tesa tape, same kind of thing. It's not going to be exact because a lot of times it's hard to match exactly what the factory had, but this will get me looking pretty close to what we had.
So it took a little time, but you can see you got my tie in there, got the harness all cleaned back up down to where it exits out to the door. Again, just using the materials that are as close as possible to what the factory stuff is. Taking your time, you can actually turn out a halfway decent looking product. Again, don't need just loose wires hanging everywhere. Now it's time to get the wiring from inside the vehicle to outside the vehicle. So anytime that you're doing anything up at the firewall, passing wiring from the engine bay into the passenger compartment, or in this case, we're going from the inside of the rear gate outside the rear gate. I always try as much as possible to go through one of the factory grommets that's down here. Those things, they're sealed up nice and tight, and if you can pass through that, then you're not making any additional intrusions through the sheet metal. Always a chance of something passing through that, whether it be water, critters, grime, whatever. So for me, I always try to use the factory grommets if at all possible. One thing I see all the time on these factory grommets here like this is when people do try and go through the factory grommet, they don't try and pass through the actual harness that's coming through, but they'll make a little slit in the side of that thing, and then they'll pass their wires through there. Problem is, when you make a slit in that rubber, you've just given it a way for it to split and just continue to split and grow. So again, then you're not sealed up in that cabin. When I'm working with long strands of wire that I got put together, and I've got multi-strand here, what I like to do is I like to go through and I tape it every, I don't know, 6-8 inches, but that just kind of keeps it together. If I have to take it back apart, it's no big thing, but it makes it easier to pass it through holes. It just makes it easier to handle in general. So just simple little thing. Again, it takes a little bit of time, but it, for me, makes a whole lot less headache in the long run. There you go. Way easier to manage. Couple of zip tie tips for you. First one, don't use the clear or the white zip ties. These things, for whatever reason, whether it's inside or outside, it seems like they just get beat up and trashed. If they're outside of a vehicle, they're getting sunlight, even just the air temperature changes. These things will crack, fall apart, and just deteriorate. I always try and use the black ones anytime I can. These going in the trash. So with this wire here that I've got hanging, I don't like it hanging like that. It moves around a lot. It can cause issues with it down the road. So I want to find a way to secure it. Luckily, on my tire carrier here, it actually has these mounting holes, so I can actually adjust for the size of tire spare that I have. I'm going to use some of those for the time being. Now, after we pull our zip tie tight, we've got that tail there. And what do we usually do? We grab a pair of diagonal cutters, we cut it off, and then we've got a nice little tail there. I don't know how many times I've been cut by those things, and it drives me nuts. So years ago, I made the huge investment of all of about $5 or $6, and I got a pair of flush cutters. And they're similar to dikes, and at a quick glance, they look like they probably are, but they are not. If you look at flush cutters, you can see it's got all the angle up here in the top, but it's really flat across the bottom, so it cuts that zip tie flush. You do have to be careful with it because it's a more delicate blade, so if anybody grabs these things and they cut a wire or something like that, they can trash the blade pretty quick. But now when you cut them, it actually cuts the zip tie. You can cut it right flush to that, but you don't have anything there to cut yourself. So spend a couple bucks, get the right tool. It makes way nicer job when you're working on the vehicle later on. So I've got my light set up here. Now I can get some lume on this stuff because I definitely don't want these thin wire or thin gauge wires just hanging loose because they'll get beat up. So we'll get some lume on that, and then we can get these things wired in. And like I mentioned earlier, I like to use heat shrink to tie that lume in. It's going to seal it up. It's going to keep it from fraying as well. Also, that's a really fine wire there, so I'm going to be able to take it right over the lume and up on top of that, the threads there for the nut on that light. And that way it's going to be sealed to the light itself, so it's not really going to want to pull that much, but it's also going to help strengthen where the wires are at. For bringing these two sets of wires together, what I did is I fed the wires from this side into the lume on the other side. You can see now I've got all 4 wires in that lume, and I want to keep them about the same length. But this other lume, I'm going to go ahead and kind of tuck it in just a little bit into the lume there. So it sits kind of like that. And then I'm going to take a piece of heat shrink and run it all the way back up to that point. Again, this is going to kind of do what that electrical tape did earlier on that other connection, but this is going to hold the lume together. And because this is the split lume, I can bring these two together in a junction like this and then the heat shrink's going to shrink down and hold everything tight. So kind of like that. And then I'll make my electrical connection. Simple little electrical job knocked out right there. A lot of the stuff that I did on that one is stuff that you can use on any electrical job that you do, whether it be just the crimps, the heat shrink, the loom that you use. Just take your time, use the right tools, make it look nice and clean, makes it easier to work on downline, makes it a whole lot easier to diagnose if you've got any issues going on there too. If you like what we're doing, give us a thumb up, maybe a little subscribe, check out what we got going on in the next couple videos. And we'll catch you guys out there on the next one.